Hi everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 3rd of December, where we have put some completion onto the informative speech, and now we are moving on to the persuasive speech. Your attendance question for today is for you to review the informative speeches of your peers and to send me an email that indicates one strength and one weakness of their speeches. I'll put all of that together and post that in the next class's notes, much like I did with speech number 1. And we are getting ready for speech 3, and I wanted to talk a little bit about not just speech 3 and the persuasive speech, but also due dates as we're getting close to the ending of the semester. Now, when I had originally structured this class, I had set aside 2 classes for the persuasive speech because it's the longest of the speeches. It's 15 minutes. And for the persuasive speech, you're going to be asked to use 3 outside sources, which I suggest that you list on your speaking outline so that when you submit in your speaking outline to me via email, I can see your sources. And you'll remember that we talked about using library sources earlier on. You can use any sources you'd like for this speech, whether you want to use a book or a magazine or a website or an interview, whatever the case may be. You don't need to have any certain number of particular kinds of sources. And I stopped counting after 3, but you can use as many sources as you'd like. And the trick is, how do you embed those sources into your speech? But the good news is that it isn't too terribly difficult because you don't have to include all of the detail that you would when you were writing a paper. So you don't have to give things like the page number or the website or the place of publication or anything like that. You just need to be clear enough when you're speaking that you are referencing somebody else's work. And it could be something even as general as according to experts, and then whatever follows after that obviously is not yours. But you should have the information somewhere so that if an audience member were to ask you a question, you could look up that information and provide them with the information to look up the source themselves. So in terms of how you list your sources on your outline, I don't necessarily care what kind of system you use. I know that in the humanities you use the MLA. I know that in the sciences you use the APA. But the reality is, if you were giving a speech to an audience and they wanted additional information about where you got your sources from, they would probably just want you to list things like the author and the title, and they probably wouldn't want it in any particular form or format. So as long as that's somehow indicated in your notes, I'm fine with that. And as I indicated, I had set aside 2 classes for the persuasive speech because it's the longer speech, and I wasn't sure how many people were going to be registered in our class. And it turns out we've got a very small class. In other words, we do not need to have 2 classes for the persuasive speech. We can do the persuasive speech in just 1 class. So I have a proposal. And what I was thinking is that rather than spend Thursday, December 10th, with the persuasive speech, we would just take that day off to prepare. Since it is the longest speech and you have to use some outside resources, I thought that you might appreciate that additional time to put it all together. And then we would all post our speeches or make arrangements with me to deliver them via Zoom, whichever you prefer, on the 15th. Which is the following Tuesday. So in other words, they would be just 1 class devoted to the persuasive speech, not 2. And that would mean that you would have a class where you could do some preparing for that speech. So that's what I've got listed in the notes below. And if you've got any strong feelings about that, if you think that's not a good idea, let me know. But I think that probably makes the most sense, considering how condensed this class is. I thought it might be useful just to have a little bit of breathing room before we put together the 3rd speech. That persuasive speech, again, 15 minutes, where you're using 3 outside sources that you would list on your outline. And a persuasive speech should be a topic that can be debated. In other words, you're not talking about a fact, you're talking about an opinion. That said, you're going to need to use facts to support your opinion. And remember, an opinion is something that can be debated by individuals. And some of the suggestions I've got when you're doing that, if you can refute the opposing side, in other words, not just present your side, but very briefly, and that's the key, briefly, talk about the counter arguments and why those are not as strong as yours. That's a tricky thing. I'm well aware, because you don't want to lose control of your speech and start talking about the other position. But it's usually better to acknowledge that there are other viewpoints than pretend that they don't exist at all. Outside sources, one of the reasons why I'm having you use outside sources is because they enhance credibility. So not only are you taking a position, but you can use experts that take that position, or use outside sources that contradict your position, and then talk about how those outside sources are not correct, or at least don't have the validity of your particular position. There are lots of different ways that you can motivate an individual to be persuaded to either take an action or take a position. And you can do either or both in terms of the context of your speech. I'm not sure if one is easier than another. Sometimes it's easier to convince somebody to take an action. So if you were to give a speech about improving diet, I'd be hard pressed to think of who would disagree with that. However, implementing that is incredibly difficult, and that's the challenge you would have, is that while most people would agree it's a good thing, most people might not be able to change their behavior. So how do you address that? And then the opposite could be the case, where you could get somebody to change their behavior very easily. If you want somebody to sign a petition, you might get them to sign it, but that doesn't necessarily mean they support the policy. They might be signing that petition because they think it's a good photo op, or purely because they just want you to go away, and then they just want to go on with their lives, so they're willing to just do whatever it is you say so that you'll disappear. So there are two sides to this. And the topics that you choose, they're almost limitless. I know that oftentimes in English 101 classes, you need to write papers where you need to take a position, and perhaps you can adapt to one of those papers. You might also want to just pay very careful attention to the news and the world around you, because there's probably all kinds of subjects on a daily basis that individuals take positions on, that you take positions on, that can be disagreed upon. You can decide to do one of those hot button controversial topics, the gun controls and the abortions of the world, but you don't have to do something controversial. You can take something that's very non-controversial, like increasing exercise, for instance. Again, most people will agree, but it's much less likely that they will be able to implement that. And it doesn't have to be something that's a topic that's global. It could be something that's much more local. So think about your own life, even your own experiences at GCC. I'm sure there have been plenty of times when you've wondered or thought, well, why do they do this when they could do that instead? And in other words, it's something that could be debated, and that could be a topic for a persuasive speech. Which, again, what I'm going to do is to ask that we have some sort of a practice session, and that you contact me so that you can run the topic by me before you actually present. So I can help you in terms of that. But in terms of how do you motivate individuals to want to support a position, or perhaps to want to take action, and that this is a complicated subject that is something that I'm very much oversimplifying. But basically, there are three ways to motivate individuals: affiliation, which means belonging; achievement, which means success; and power, which means control. And a good way to gauge this is to look at your typical television commercial where they're trying to influence your behavior to get you to buy a particular product. And they'll oftentimes use one or all of these techniques at the same time. Affiliation, or belonging. In other words, if you want to be like everybody else, if you want to be like the cool person, you want to buy the number one product, you also will be getting the new iPhone, or whatever the case may happen to be. You want to be part of the group, part of the tribe. Achievement, success. The idea of, if you can purchase an iPhone, then you've achieved a certain level of success, because it's not an inexpensive purchase. And it also is a purchase that probably requires a certain amount of technological savvy. And power and control. Think about what this device might be able to offer you. You could basically have the world in your fingertips. Our smartphones today are more powerful than the computers that set the first man on the moon, believe it or not. So all three of these can be used in various combinations, and all of the above. There is one way to motivate that is incredibly effective, but I caution you against doing this: using fear. Now, that said, I think you've probably seen in the media how that oftentimes is used to motivate individual opinion and behavior. It is very effective, but you've got to be very cautious, because it can interfere with reasoning. So be careful when you're using fear and think about what the ultimate purpose is. You know, the idea of using fear in order to generate profit, I don't know if that's the best way to use fear. Using fear to protect, perhaps there's justification for that. So if you think about things like ads about lung cancer and smoking, they're trying to use fear to get you to change your behavior, to stop smoking. And you might say that the ends justify the means in that particular respect. But the fear that, you know, you're going to be left out and you're not going to be like everybody else because you don't buy your iPhone, I don't know if that's necessarily, you know, the most moral way to go about selling product. Now, the text talks about something called Monroe's motivated sequence. In other words, the steps you go through when you're trying to convince an audience of something. But I would say that these are the steps that you take for the most part in any of the speeches that you've been delivering. Attention, need, satisfaction, visualization, action. In other words, get your audience's attention, illustrate that there's some sort of need, then show how your proposal can help to satisfy that need. Visualize it, try to give as much details as possible so that we can understand it. And if you wanted us to take a particular action, again, something like signing a petition, this would be the time to do it. Now, the way you're going to do this is by putting together an argument where you've got a claim, a position, where you're using evidence in order to support that position, and some sort of reasoning pattern. And just because something is a claim, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a fact. Even if it says it's a claim of fact, and I gave an example in the notes below that you can see, when you're saying something is or is not the case. Think of the claim that GCC is a small school, which is in fact, it's true. But in comparison to what? GCC might be considered to be a large school in comparison to other schools. It just depends. A claim of value. Something is good or bad. GCC is a good school. And again, the question is, how do you measure that? Test scores, student evaluations, how? Or a claim of value a claim of policy that you should take a particular course of action. For instance, GCC should reestablish a sports program. There are pros and cons to that. And in fact, GCC used to have a sports program, but it was eliminated because of budgetary concerns. Claims of policy or courses of action are oftentimes things that are debated in the workplace, and it's very difficult to come to a clear and definitive conclusion. The way you do that, hopefully, is through reasoning. And the way you can apply reasoning is either inductively or deductively. For any of you mystery fans, you Sherlock Holmes fans, if you're using inductive reasoning, then you're using examples. Think about something like medical studies, for instance, in order to illustrate that a medication or a vaccine, let's say, is effective. Deductive reasoning is a generalization from those specific examples. So let's say a generalization that I suspect that most of you agree with is that college leads to success, or else you wouldn't be enrolled in this class. It is a generalization. College doesn't always lead to success, but there are enough specific examples of college leading to success that you can make that generalization and have it have a certain level of truth to it. You can also reason from sign, where there's an observable mark, and that illustrates how you're going to form a judgment. For instance, a sore throat could be the sign that you're getting a head cold. This is the mark. There are enough specific instances, examples, inductive reasoning, where this sore throat has led to a cold. So you can generalize that this sore throat will probably once again lead to a head cold. So those are most of the major pieces in the section about persuasive speeches. The second piece was in errors in reasoning. And this, too, is a very complex subject that I am overgeneralizing about. We spent an entire semester talking about this. But just very briefly, some of the ways that people make mistakes with the way that they reason. And the reality is we all do this. Hasty generalization, where you're making a generalization with too little evidence. If you'll remember, we had talked a little bit about stereotypes, and that's usually what happens with the stereotype, is that you're overgeneralizing. And when you're making a hasty generalization, you're making your generalization, it's too soon. You're drawing an assumption. So, for instance, you might make the assumption that a particular class is not popular because it hasn't filled at GCC for the last several semesters. But is that true that it's the class, or could it be another factor? The time the class is offered, or the instructor, or another outside variable. So you need to be very careful you're not making a hasty generalization. Or an appeal to ignorance. In other words, what we don't know. Prove me wrong. So, in other words, the burden of proof is no longer on me. The burden of proof is on you. So I say I'm a space alien, and the burden of proof is on you to prove that I'm not a space alien, rather than the burden of proof on me to prove that I am a space alien. Or bandwagon fallacy. In other words, join the crowd. Everybody else is doing it. I call it the typical teenage argument. Everybody else gets to go to the party. How come I can't go to the party? Sequential fallacy, that we assume that there's a cause and effect relationship with things, that the first influences the second. Maybe, maybe not. I've seen this happen in politics very frequently. If a politician is in power and the economy is going well, then that politician will take credit. If the politician is in power and the economy is doing poorly, that politician will say outside forces are at play. So just because there are two things that are happening one after the other, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are connected. Begging the question is just merely rephrasing the question, and it's also known as circular reasoning. So for instance, if you were asked a question, for instance on a quiz, what is empathic listening? And you respond by saying listening empathically. You're not basically answering the question, which is asking you to define empathy, basically emotionally supportive listening. Instead, what you're doing is just rephrasing the question. What is the faculty parking lot? It's the lot where faculty park. Again, you're just rephrasing the words. You're not saying anything. Appeal to authority. Now, that sounds like it has a certain level of validity. The problem is the authority is not an authority. The authority is somebody who has popularity, but they may not necessarily, and they probably don't, have expertise. We oftentimes see this with the celebrity endorsement on television, where there is a celebrity that is endorsing a particular product. They have no knowledge or expertise about that particular product, but they are popular. So the assumption is that if they are endorsing a particular product, then you would want to be like that celebrity. If they're endorsing a particular kind of laptop computer, let's say, but the person is a football player. The thing is, their profession has nothing to do with computers, but they're popular. So the idea is if they're using that kind of laptop, maybe you do too. And name calling, which I think is pretty obvious. It's the attack on the individual. It's what I call the schoolyard argument, what kids do. And I've always said that, you can't make these things up, that sometimes rather than just giving hypothetical examples that are not based in reality, that instead you can come up with something that's real, and that's what I've got for you. And there's an article that I would like you to read, and you can see the link below in our section on errors in reasoning, as well as a short video. And I can give you the context of this situation that happened several years ago during an academic debate at a university. If you know anything about debates, they're basically made up of teams of individuals, and these teams are supposed to put forth an argument. So one team puts forth one side, let's say the pro. The other team from another school puts forth the opposite side, let's say the con. And then they basically present their arguments, and then there's a panel of judges that ranks which side gave the stronger argument. So it's almost like what would happen in a courtroom, but rather than with a defense and prosecuting attorney, you've got it with the team of individuals, the debate team. And things did not go well during this particular debate. And I'm sure that probably the assumption is that, well, probably the students on the debate team lost control. No, that's not what happened. It was the debate coaches, the two professors from the different universities who were running the debate, who lost control. And I think this is a wonderful example of what happens with errors in reasoning, and also what happens when you let emotions stand in the way of intellect. Obviously, both of these individuals very well educated and having advanced degrees in the field of debate and communication, and they did this for a living. However, they let their emotions get in the way. And the subtext is kind of complex. These are two individuals who did not particularly like one another and who had faced each other before in debating situations. So there was already bad blood between them. One of the debate coaches was a Caucasian male. The other debate coach was a black female. So there's that tension between the two. And I mention this because there definitely is that tension because the debate happened to be about race. And while all of the details haven't necessarily been included on the internet, it turns out that enough of that debate was posted on the internet that resulted in one being fired and the other being put on probation. If you're curious, it was the Caucasian male who was fired. At one point, he actually mooned his other opponent. Yes, I said that. He mooned it. But he was wearing underwear. So I don't know if that's technically mooning somebody if you just dropped his pants and he was wearing underwear. The other, she was put on probation. And the clip that I have for you to see is only a couple minutes long or so. The debate is much, much longer. And the debate was never meant to be filmed, let alone be posted online. Let that be a message to you that in today's technological world, you never know where you might end up. And as much as both of these debate coaches have tried to have this completely removed from the internet, they have been unsuccessful thus far because it just keeps reappearing in different places. And I've got a snippet for you to watch from YouTube where you can actually see them yelling profanities at one another. So that's probably one of the more extreme examples I can think of name calling. I believe you also get to see that mooning or that supposed mooning as well. To show how you can't lose control of your emotions when things get heated. And that ultimately, even the best of us can make errors in reasoning. So you want to be very careful when you're putting forth your argument that you're not doing that. And when you're listening to the arguments of others, you're making sure, hopefully, that they are not committing errors in reasoning. So again, in terms of today's attendance question, if you could please send to my email one strength and one weakness of speech number 2 from each of your classmates. Those speeches should be uploaded by now. And then what I will do next class is I will have a list of that as well for you to review, as well as a sample speech for you to review, a sample persuasive speech. And we will have our third quiz at that point. And then unless I hear otherwise, unless there's strong objection, what we would do is take December 10th off and use that as a day for preparing for our persuasive speech. And then finally on the 15th, you would be presenting speech number 3, your persuasive speech, which would leave us with just one last class where we would have quiz number 4 for those of you who elect to take quiz 4, since I dropped the lowest quiz grade. And that would basically make our semester. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, you'll have a sample speech. You'll be able to see the comments from your classmates about your speech. And we will be able to take a quiz. Take care. Hope you're doing well. Bye-bye.